In the middle of the 18th century, on a narrow lane in Frankfurt where the gates were locked at night and the residents were forbidden to own land anywhere else in the city, a coin dealer named Meyer Amschel Rothschild raised 10 children and a house barely wide enough to spread your arms. 200 years later, his descendants would own some of the largest private houses ever built in Europe, would entertain emperors and kings beneath glass ceilings the size of cathedral naves, and would assemble art collections so vast that one of them required 30 railway cars to haul away. The distance between those two facts is the story of the Rothschilds, and the most vivid way to tell it is through their many mansions. Hi everyone, Ken here. Hit that subscribe button and let's dive into a special episode of This House. The name came from a sign. In the 16th century, an ancestor lived in a Frankfurt house marked Zum Roten Schild, meaning at the Red Shield, and the name stuck even after the family moved elsewhere in the Judengasse. A red shield still sits at the center of the Rothschild coat of arms today. Meyer Amschel Rothschild bought the larger house of the Green Shield in 1784, and it was there, in cramped quarters in the locked Jewish lane, that the dynasty took shape. He made himself useful to the immensely wealthy Elector of Hesse Castle, handling coins and then loans, and then the discreet movement of money across a continent at war. When he died in 1812, he left behind something more durable than a fortune. He left a plan. That plan was his 5 sons, who became known as the 5 Arrows after the 5 arrows clutched in the talon of the family crest, bound together because no one single arrow could be easily broken. Amschel stayed in Frankfurt to mind the original house. Solomon went to Vienna, Nathan to London, where he built the bank that became the hinge of the whole enterprise, Karl to Naples, and James, the youngest, to Paris, where he became the richest private citizen in France. In 1822, the Emperor of Austria made all 5 of them barons. From these 5 men, posted to 5 capitals, came a constellation of houses that would eventually stretch from the Bay of Naples to the moors of Buckinghamshire. Solomon Meyer von Rothschild arrived in a Vienna that would not let a Jew own property, but in time that changed, and eventually there were 5 Palais Rothschild in Vienna, and their fates between them tell the whole arc of the family's Austrian century, from triumph to catastrophe. His son Anselm built a deliberately understated palace on the Rheingasse that still stands and now houses a bank. The grandest of the 5 was the Palais Albert Rothschild, built in the late 1870s and early 1880s in a French Renaissance style. A vast mansion arranged around a courtyard, fitted with a rooftop observatory for its astronomically minded owner. After World War II, the building was neglected and then demolished in 1954. A second-grade palace with 15 salons decorated in the style of the 17th and 18th centuries was damaged in the war and likewise pulled down in the early 1950s. 2 of the Vienna palaces survive in other hands, one long used by the city's music university and another now serving as the Brazilian embassy. When German forces entered Vienna, the Rothschild art collections, the largest in Jewish hands in all of Austria, were among the very first to be plundered. The head of the Austrian house, Louis von Rothschild, was held prisoner until his family paid what was said to be one of the largest ransoms in history for a single individual. The Austrian Rothschilds were not only city dwellers, they became some of the largest landowners in the country, assembling enormous hunting estates across Lower Austria and building or rebuilding a string of country castles to go with them. A medieval water castle at Ensfeld sheltered the Duke of Windsor for several months after he gave up the British throne in 1936. These were the country retreats of a family at the height of its Austrian power, and like the city palaces, most were torn from the family's hands in 1938. East of Vienna, in the industrial borderlands of what is now the Czech Republic, the Austrian Rothschilds held Schillersdorf, an estate that mattered to them as much as any palace, because it sat beside the source of a great deal of their money, ironworks. Now, if Vienna shows the family at its most tragic, France shows it at its most magnificent, for it was in France that the Rothschilds built on the largest scale and lived in the grandest manner. James Meyer de Rothschild, the youngest of the 5 brothers, made the Paris house into a financial power that helped build the French railways and finance the French state, and he made himself the richest private individual in the country. When such a man builds a country house, he does not build modestly. He built the largest and most luxurious chateau of the 19th century in France, and the story of how he commissioned it has the ring of legend, though the buildings at either end of it are real enough to visit. James had bought the Ferrières estate east of Paris in 1829. When he decided to build, he looked across the channel at a house his own nephew was raising in England, Mentmore Towers, and liked it so much that he summoned its architect, the Englishman Joseph Paxton, who had designed the Crystal Palace, and reportedly instructed him to build the same thing twice the size. Paxton obliged. Ferrières rose between 1855 and 1859, a vast pile in the Renaissance manner with a square tower at each of its four corners, set on a formal terrace looking out over parkland in the English taste with an estate of thousands of acres. Its heart was a central hall 120 feet long and 60 feet high, roofed entirely in glass in homage to the Crystal Palace, so that visitors entering for the first time looked up into a flood of daylight falling from overhead. The decoration was supervised by a leading painter of the day, the sculptural work executed by a celebrated sculptor, and the library held more than 8,000 volumes. The house was built with 80 guest suites and stabling for 80 horses, with quarters for 100 servants and an underground railway to carry hot food from a separate kitchen building so that no cooking smells would reach the family. When it was inaugurated in 1862, the Emperor Napoleon III himself came to the housewarming, planted a tree, and was serenaded by the chorus of the Paris Opera conducted by Rossini. Ferrières was almost too grand for its own good. During the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, the advancing Germans made it their headquarters, and it was here that Bismarck received the French foreign minister for the failed peace negotiations that would prolong the war and the siege of Paris. The Germans came back in the Second World War and looted its art. The house stood empty for years afterward, until, in 1959, Guy and Marie-Helene de Rothschild brought it spectacularly back to life, refurbishing it and hosting some of the most famous costume balls of the 20th century within its walls. In 1975, the family gave the chateau to the University of Paris, its glass-roofed halls once again full of life. Ferrières was the giant, but it was far from alone. The French Rothschilds built and bought a dense network of houses, and a regional tour of them shows just how thoroughly the family wove itself into the French landscape. Near Ferrières stood Château de Montvillers, rebuilt for Baron Edmond de Rothschild in an Anglo-Norman style in the late 1870s and held by the family for a century before being sold to the King of Morocco. In Paris itself, the family occupied a constellation of grand townhouses, the Hôtel Particulier that lined the most fashionable streets, including the splendid Hôtel Salomon de Rothschild built in the 1870s on the site of Balzac's former home, later left to the French state and now given over to cultural uses. The family's reach extended even to one of the most storied houses in Paris, the 17th century Hôtel Lambert on the Ile Saint-Louis, with interiors by the painters who had decorated Versailles, which Guy and Marie-Helene de Rothschild bought in 1975. The French houses reached south as well, into the vineyards, where the family's name became attached to two of the most famous wine estates on earth. Château Lafite Rothschild was bought by Baron James in 1868, the year of his death, crowning a lifetime of acquisition with the most prestigious vineyard in France. The most enchanting of the French houses sits not in Paris or its countryside, but on a narrow promontory of the Riviera, between the blue of the sea on one side and the blue of the bay on the other, and it was built not by a baron, but by a baroness. Beatrice de Rothschild, daughter of the great Parisian collector Baron Alphonse, inherited her father's fortune in 1905 and used part of it to build a dream house on Cap Ferrat, and named it Villa Ephrussi de Rothschild. She was a famously exacting client, rejecting designs from several of the leading architects of the day before she was satisfied. Built between 1907 and 1912 in the manner of an Italian Renaissance palace and painted a distinctive rose pink, the villa is wrapped on its narrow headland by 9 separate gardens, each in a different style, French and Spanish and Florentine and Japanese among them. Inside, Beatrice assembled the eclectic riches that the family name implies, old master paintings and 18th century furniture and rare porcelain, an old painted ceiling set up of the grand salon, and a games table that had belonged to Marie Antoinette herself, that recurring Rothschild thread of royal provenance. When she died in 1934, she left the villa and everything in it to the Académie des Beaux-Arts, and it has been a museum ever since, its pink walls and themed gardens among the most photographed sites on the whole coast. Inland from the Riviera, near the great forest and racing town of Chantilly, stands a house whose afterlife is as interesting as its construction. The Château de Fontaine was begun in 1879 for Baron James Edouard de Rothschild, a noted book collector, and finished around 1882 by his widow after his early death. The architect was a favorite of the family, and the design mixed medieval and 17th century and classical elements under steep roofs and high turrets, built, in a sign of the times, around a metal framework. The Baroness used it as a summer house, and in the philanthropic habit of the family, founded a dispensary, a school, and a library for the local village. Its later history reads like a parable of the 20th century. The German Air Force requisitioned the estate during the Second World War and built a bunker in its park. After the war, the property was sold to the Jesuits, who turned it into a great center of learning, building up a library that grew to 500,000 volumes and more. And at the very end of the century, unable to maintain such a palace, the Jesuits sold it in turn to a large technology consulting company, which opened the chateau as an international training campus, where today, young consultants study in rooms that once held a baroness's summer guests and then a religious order's scholars. Few houses have served 3 such different masters with such apparent ease. The shores of Lake Geneva drew the Rothschilds as they drew so much of European wealth, and here, one branch built a house remembered above all for its gardens. The Château de Ferrières, overlooking the lake near Geneva, was built in 1858 for Baron Adolf Karl von Rothschild. He pulled down the existing villa on the site and entrusted the new chateau to Joseph Paxton, the same Englishman who built Mentmore and Ferrières. Ferrières became famous for its conservatories, some 27 greenhouses in which the most exotic plants were coaxed to flower, and the Empress of Austria was among the visitors enchanted by them. Ferrières was one of the lucky houses. Unlike so many of its relatives, it escaped wartime looting entirely, and the family left it to the state of Geneva in 1957, while keeping the right to live there so that it remains a Rothschild residence to this day, a rare thread of unbroken continuity and a story so full of losses. The Dutch chapter of the Rothschild story produced what many consider to be the single most romantic building in the entire family, a fairy tale castle that is also improbably the largest castle in the Netherlands. It came into the family not through one of the banking branches directly, but through marriage, when a Dutch baron with an ancient ruined castle married a French Rothschild with the means to rebuild it on any scale he could imagine. Baron Etienne von Zuylen had inherited the ruins of De Haar, a castle first recorded in the 14th century and repeatedly burned and ruined over the centuries until little was left but romantic decay. In 1887, he married Baroness Helene de Rothschild, and with the Rothschild fortune behind them, the couple commissioned the most celebrated Dutch architect of the age, Pierre Cuypers, to raise the castle from its ruins. Cuypers worked on it for 20 years, from 1892 to 1912, following the old foundations but building upward into his own idealized version of what a medieval castle ought to be. The result has 200 rooms and 30 bathrooms and was equipped behind its medieval face with every modern comfort of the new century. Its own electrical generator, central heating, hot and cold running water, a passenger lift, and a Turkish bath. The enclosed main hall soars some 60 feet in the manner of a church, gilded and glowing with stained glass. The carved woodwork, executed in the architect's own workshops, is so dense and so ecclesiastical that visitors often feel they have wandered into a cathedral rather than a home. Around the castle, a vast park was laid out, for which the Baron ordered 7,000 mature trees, and to make room for it, the entire neighboring village was demolished and rebuilt a kilometer away, only the church being spared. Throughout the castle, details quietly acknowledge the source of the fortune that built it. Stars of David worked into the balconies of the Knights' Hall, and the Rothschild arms set above the library fireplace. The family transferred the castle to a foundation in 2000, and it is now a museum, though by tradition, the family still occupies it for 1 month each year, keeping the old fairy tale faintly alive. The Italian branch was the first of the 5 to close, and is the least remembered today, but it too left a house, and the house still stands, looking out over the Bay of Naples. From the 1840s, Karl Meyer von Rothschild occupied the Villa Pignatelli, a graceful neoclassical villa in Naples, which he embellished in the family manner, one richly decorated room from his time surviving to this day. We come at last to England, where Nathan Meyer Rothschild had built the bank that anchored the whole family enterprise, and where his descendants built houses so thickly across one corner of the country that people gave the area a nickname. So many Rothschilds settled in the Vale of Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire that it became known, half in jest and half in earnest, as Rothschildshire. The first of the great Buckinghamshire houses was Mentmore Towers, built in the early 1850s for Baron Meyer de Rothschild by Joseph Paxton in a grand revival of the English Jacobean style, with a glass-roofed central hall and an art collection of such quantity that it inspired the even larger Ferrières in France. Mentmore passed by marriage to the Earls of Rosebery, and when the family could no longer keep it, the government of the day declined the chance to buy it for the nation, so that its famous contents were scattered at a landmark auction in 1977 that became a byword for a national treasure let slip. Around Mentmore, the family built a whole landscape of houses, and a regional tour of them gives a sense of the sheer density of the Rothschild life in this once green corner of England. There was Aston Clinton House, since demolished. There was Ascot House, a farm enlarged into a comfortable country house and given to the National Trust in 1950. There was Halton House, built in the early 1880s for Alfred de Rothschild in a flamboyant French style that some contemporaries found vulgar and others found delightful, opened with a gala for the Prince of Wales and sold after the First World War to the Royal Air Force, which uses it as an officer's mess to this day. There was Tring Park, where Walter Rothschild, the eccentric zoologist of the family who famously drove a carriage pulled by zebras, created a natural history museum that survives as part of the national collections. Nathan's suburban estate at Gunnersbury Park in West London became a beloved family home with celebrated gardens before being sold to the local councils in the 1920s and opened as a public park, its mansion now a museum. And so we arrive at the house that is, for many people, the Rothschild house above all others, the most complete and most beloved expression of everything this family built and collected and aspired to. Waddesdon Manor was built for Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild, a member of the Viennese branch who had settled in England, on a bare hilltop in Buckinghamshire that he bought in 1874 with nothing on it but farmland and a fine view. Ferdinand wanted a French chateau, and he hired a French architect to give him one, modeled on the great Renaissance houses of the Loire Valley. The making of it, between 1874 and 1889, was a feat of will against the landscape itself. The top of the hill was carved away by some 30 feet to make a level platform. Water was piped 7 miles from the nearest town. A railway was built up the hillside to carry the stone, and to give the new gardens the look of an established age, fully grown trees were dragged into place by teams of as many as 16 horses, their roots bound in canvas so that the grounds looked a century old the day they were finished. Behind its French face, the house was thoroughly modern, built on a steel frame with central heating and an electric system of bells to summon the servants. Waddesdon was built to hold Ferdinand's superb collection of 18th century French furniture, Sevres porcelain, Savonnerie carpets, and tapestries hung about with English portraits by Reynolds and Gainsborough and the Dutch old masters, the whole assembled with the unerring eye and bottomless purse that the family name came to guarantee. Queen Victoria herself even came to see it in 1890, reportedly fascinated by the electric light. Waddesdon is the great survivor. It passed from Ferdinand to his sister Alice and then to a French great-nephew, and in 1957 it was given, with its contents and a large endowment to maintain it, to the National Trust. It is managed today by a Rothschild Foundation on the Trust's behalf, its rooms kept much as they were, its cellar stocked with the family's own wine. Of all the houses in this story, it is the one where a visitor can come closest to the world the Rothschilds made, walking through rooms that still hold the furniture of kings, under the roof of a chateau conjured out of a Buckinghamshire hilltop by a banker who wanted a piece of the Loire in England. Step back from the individual houses and a pattern comes clear. The Rothschilds did not scatter their mansions at random. They clustered, deliberately building near one another, brother beside brother and cousin beside cousin. 5 palaces in one quarter of Vienna, and a dozen houses in one quarter of Buckinghamshire, and a string of chateaux around Paris and Chantilly and Geneva. The houses were a family knit together in stone, the same instinct that bound the 5 arrows in the family crest expressed in bricks and gardens and glass-roofed halls. They were also, almost everywhere, instruments of arrival. A family that had been locked in a ghetto and forbidden to own land, within 2 generations, built some of the largest private houses in Europe and filled them with the furniture of the very monarchs whose societies had once excluded them. Every glass ceiling and gilded salon and table that had served a queen was an argument, made in the most luxurious possible language, that the Rothschilds belonged at the top. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. Which of these mansions was your favorite? Let me know down below in the comments section, and while you're there, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an exciting episode of This House.